if you could paint a picture of the first 4 games of Mack Brown's 6th season, what would it look like?
It'd be like a roller coaster, but with things only going maybe in one direction. Would that be fair? I think you're exactly right. What you just said. That give them credit for going into Minnesota and winning. Although Minnesota was picked maybe 13th in the Big Ten preseason poll.
Yeah, but isn't that top half of that league? I kid. I kid.
Close.
Yeah.
And so, give them credit, but at the same time, that wasn't that impressive of a victory. And then Charlotte is just a mess right now.
Yeah.
And that game was a lot closer than it needed to be. A&T, or Central, sorry, was kind of the same situation. Carolina struggled early. And then Carolina just did not look prepared against James Madison
right
off the bat. I mean, there was a busted play, the very first offensive play that allowed JMU to get into a rhythm, and they really never looked back. And the big issue, yes, you can bang on the defense, as we've banged on the defense for going on 12 years now, but it wasn't just the defense. Like, yes, the offense racked up some yardage, but there were some bad turnovers there. I mean, 5 turnovers overall. Special teams was really a mess. So a lot of things kind of went wrong. Coming into the season, I think I picked them at 8-4. And one of the reasons I did is because if you look at what this schedule was, really the only good teams in the preseason appeared to be Florida State and NC State. And now looking at the schedule, it's like, wow, where are the really good teams? So because of that, I still think there's potential for this team to get to a bowl game. Clearly, they are not an ACC contender, and it's just kind of a mess right now.
Greg Barnes, Inside Carolina, is joining us here on the Adam Gold Show at GS Barnes 23 on Twitter. And this game, though, because this is the way I've termed it. While I was surprised because I didn't think it was vintage JMU, I knew it was going to be difficult because I didn't think North Carolina offensively was that good. Now, maybe had Max Johnson stayed healthy, he would have become a more competent quarterback. He didn't look good before the injury at Minnesota. It didn't look like they had much of an offense then, but I allow for the fact that it is game one, even though he had been here through the spring and all of that. But first game, okay, we won't judge there. But it didn't certainly look good for 3 quarters. Connor Harrell just doesn't look like he could throw the ball down the field accurately. And I always thought at some point we'd get to Jacoby Criswell, who I'm not sure is all that great either. But if they can't have a competent offense, it's going to be tough on Amari and Hampton. And if Carolina can't control the game on the ground, I just don't know what they can do.
Correct. And one of the talking points in the offseason was, okay, Sam Howell's gone. Drake May's gone. What now? And a lot of the conversation from within the program was like, look, this is going to be the deepest team that Max had since he's been back. This is the opportunity this year to show that it's not just about the quarterback. It's about having a very good defense, maybe not elite, but at least pretty good, being solid on special teams, having a really good rushing attack with Amari and Hampton starring, and then have serviceable QB play. And it makes sense. That's what you should be able to do. And to your point, I don't know that we've seen that. And so I think Saturday is very important for a lot of different reasons. But I think Manny's done a pretty good job thus far with what Duke has been able to do. And I think that'll be a significant test for North Carolina. And that will tell us a lot about whether this team can get to a bowl game, can actually have some success or not. Because if they don't look good at all in Durham on Saturday, it's going to make for a long October and November.
Well, I do think that North Carolina's problem in many ways has been focus over the course of not just Mack Brown. I go back to Larry Fedora, where they gave up 70 points to East Carolina. I mean, there have been some big numbers hung when sometimes Tar Heel, players start thinking about how good they are. And I'm not saying they were thinking about that because they played the game against Central. There wasn't somebody that just saw the final score and thought, oh, well, North Carolina dominated that game. They were in it. They knew it was 17-10 heading to the fourth quarter. So focus to me has been an issue for UNC in the past. But focus is never a problem for Mack Brown in this particular game. 5-0 against Duke since the return. And it's not like Duke has been old Duke when, Fred Goldsmith Duke. They've been good over the last several years. Maybe not what they were early in the David Cutcliffe era, but they have been good. So the fact that Mack is 5-0 against the Blue Devils is not insignificant. How big a game is this, do you believe, for Mack personally, not just because he wants to win the victory bell again, but just to get people off his back? Because I think right now there are a lot of people wondering how much longer he's going to be around.
Yeah, and especially in light of what happened in the post-game locker room after James Madison.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the critical point because they've circled the wagons. They kind of have their story of, hey, this is actually what happened. It's a little bit different than what was reported, which is fine. What matters is does the team are they all on the same page? And
right.
Do they agree with everything with how it's moving forward? Because at the end of the day, that is all that matters. And so I think Saturday will go a long way in telling us. And there's some games, Adam, where you can say, you know what, we really just need to see them play hard and play well. It doesn't necessarily matter if they win or lose. Well, this certainly is not that game.
Mm-mm.
This is a game where they need to look good and they need to win. And that's the first step in kind of moving past all the circus aspects of these past couple of days. And that's what's so important for Mack, because if they don't look good and they lose, well, everything that's been drummed up is only going to start again, because now you're talking about, okay, you're 0-1 in conference play. You've lost 2 in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're starting to play some teams that are actually playing better. What's going to happen? And there's no way to stem that tide without putting a solid performance on the field.
Yeah, and you alluded to it. The schedule looked pretty comfortable, but I think Duke has played pretty well. Duke is certainly an aggressive defense. I think they lead the league in tackles for loss. They have I think, a very big play passing game as well. Running game hasn't been as good as they would have liked. Pitt has somehow figured out a way to win a bunch of games against some pretty good teams. Georgia Tech, I think at the very least, is solid. Virginia has been better than advertised. By the time they get to Florida State and it's in Tallahassee, who knows what Florida State looks like? They could have already mailed it in completely, or they might be, back competing, even though it hasn't gone well for FSU. But so the schedule is not as comfortable as it looked at the beginning. Of course, if North Carolina plays to their capabilities, maybe it'll be fine. Let me ask you a couple of questions real quick about Mack, because I thought last year that he looked like a guy who was ready to call it a career, and he deserves all of the accolades for his career. He's one of the best. But I thought he was kind of done after last year. Were you surprised that he came back for another one?
I won't say that I was surprised. However, that was certainly bouncing around in my head. Is this going to be it? The fact that Drake May is gone now, there are legitimate question marks at quarterback moving forward. It's not as smooth sailing as maybe as it has been. And the fact that he came back and did 5 years worth of work,
mm-hmm.
got North Carolina through COVID, did a pretty good job rebuilding the talent base. He did a great job repairing connections with high school coaches,
yep.
which is very important. He got the boosters back involved. So you're right. He's done a lot of fantastic stuff for the program. But you do have to ask the question, how long does he see himself coaching? And one of the interesting things is I think a lot of us assumed that when he was brought in, it would be that kind of stopgap deal where, hey, he comes in for 5 years,
mm-hmm.
kind of balances things out, then you hand it off to somebody on the upswing. And there's really been no indication from anybody in the administration that was the plan. It was just, Mack's coming back, and we're going to see how this works out. And so I don't know that there is necessarily a plan in place for when he leaves. Yes, the fact that he blew up the way he did after the game on Saturday, even though you're 3-1,
right,
speaks to a lot of frustration. And I think that's kind of been building with how Carolina has failed to close really the last 3 years. And so I think it's a valid question of what's the plan here moving forward. How long does Mack want to do this? If things don't start moving on an upswing, or you just kind of playing things out to the end? And I think that's really where Bubba Cunningham needs to figure out what the plan is. Of course, he doesn't have to tell Dodge.
Right.
That's something important for them to have ironed out probably sooner than later.
It's funny. We talked to Bubba Cunningham a week ago yesterday or tomorrow, and we knew the game would be difficult, but I didn't feel like asking him, "Hey, what's the plan after Mack?" Even though I had kind of thought about it, but we didn't. We don't have 30 minutes to talk to Bubba Cunningham, so we were happy with the 15 that we got. Final question, and this speaks to the way Mack handled the end of the game, the post game. Because it really did put a lot of pressure on players to have to deal with the emotion of their coaches' emotions. What's your sense of how the players have reacted to all this?
Well, what I can tell you is that the initial concern by a handful of players, at least, that we're aware of, was to the extent of what's going to happen next if Mack ultimately decides to resign, what happens to my scholarship for next year? Mm-hmm. So these are real serious questions that were being asked. And to the extent that we have reported since then that Bubba Cunningham had some meetings with players mm-hmm. to figure out what their thoughts were and how to move forward best. So certainly there's concern. There is a feeling that, hey, everything's kind of been wrapped up, everybody's back on the same page, and we're ready to move forward. But that remains to be seen. That all sounds good. But when you hit adversity again, what's it put together with, right? I mean, is it just duct tape? Is there something significant there holding everything together? And that's what we have to see. And then the other thing I want to throw in here, Adam, Mack has really pushed NIL mm-hmm. and how Carolina has been lacking in NIL, and that's been a big problem on the recruiting trail and all those things. And that's a valid point. However, when you get 70 hung on you by JMU, who had to rebuild their program,
yep.
literally rebuild their program in January because they had 65 new players coming in and an entire new coaching staff, Mack could have had any single player he wanted on that JMU roster. And so when you start kind of harping on NIL being a part of the problem, and then you turn around and have that performance that you did on Saturday, there's a disconnect there. And I think that's probably the biggest thing is, it's not so much infrastructure if the guys aren't doing the basic stuff on the field of play to beat teams you should be beating. And so that's some of the complexity involved.
There's a lot going on. Look, I have no idea what's going to happen on Saturday at Wallace Wade Stadium. But if it doesn't turn out well for UNC, I think the temperature just goes up over at Kenan Stadium. But I don't think you take that. That's not tremendously insightful. That is just obvious. Greg Barnes, Inside Carolina at GS Barnes 23 on Twitter. Thank you very much for your time. We'll talk again very soon. You're a legend.
All right. Well, thank you, Adam. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care.